Now begins the recitation of the Aletheon, the divine avataric self-revelation of His divine presence. Avatar, Adi, Da, Samraj. This is moving beyond childish and adolescent approaches to life and truth. In the current exchanges about the true way of life, people are alternatively invited either to submit themselves in childish, emotional, and cultic fashion, usually by grace of hype, to one or another glamorous tradition, personality, or possible effect, or else to assert their adolescent independence from any divine influence, master, or way by engaging in any one of the seemingly numberless, cool, mental, and strategic methods of self-indulgence, self-absorption, self-help, deprogramming, or certified sudden transcendentalism now available in these media-motivated times. In the midst of the pervasive language of these offerings is all the implicit crawling fear of children and adolescents, surrounded by parent, waiting for Wednesday, wasting weekends on authorities who preach against authority, or who promote peculiar enthusiasms for secret, unique, scriptural, and wholly fulfilling techniques for bodily, emotional, and mental absorptions in the one true reality, which everyone advertises, but very few find sufficient. Religious, spiritual, and philosophical revivals are so plastic and popular as mindless as soap, and yet they seem always to distract the world. I am not the usual man. All that I teach has been awakened and tested in my own case. There is grace. There is truth. There is transcendental, spiritual, real, acausal God, which is both reality itself and truth itself. There are true and false or fruitless ways to live. There are partial revelations. What is only distraction and foolishness has always been part of the theater of humankind. This need not be of concern. If the need for true illumination is strong enough, what each one is obliged to do is to realize, in his or her own case, a heart that is the center of one's life, that is neither self-indulgent nor foolish, and that is responsible only to truth itself. Experiences high and low are required by those who are still lingering in the conditions of their childhood and adolescence. Everything a child does is a manifestation of one underlying presumption: dependence. When you are a child, the presumption of dependence is eminently realistic and useful, but it should be a temporary stage of psychophysical life in which one's functions are nurtured and developed in conventional ways. However, there is commonly a lag in the transition to adulthood because of the shocks encountered in the immature attempts to function in the world. Thus, to some degree, every adult lingers in the childhood presumption of dependence, and insofar as adults are children, they seek to enlarge that personal presumption of dependence into a universal conception in the form of the God-Cosmos parent game, the game of dependence upon and obedience to that upon which all depends. That childish aspect in each individual always seeks to verify the condition of dependence in forms of safety and relative unconsciousness. That childish demand in every adult human being is the principal origin of exoteric religion. Exoteric religion is the search to be reunited, to experience the vital and emotional re-establishment of some imagined or felt condition or state of life that is previous to responsibility. It is the urge toward the parented enclosed condition. This urge always seeks experiences, beliefs, and immunities as a consolation for the primitive cognition of fear and vulnerability. And the way enacted by such a motivation is principally a game of obedience to parent-like enormities. It is in childhood that the idea of God apart or reality beyond is conceived. The sense of dependence initiates the growing sense of separate and separated self through the experiential theater of growth. The intuition of the whole, the one, is the ground of birth, but growing up is a conventional pattern of initiation in which the sense of difference is intensified. At the conventional level of the life functions themselves, there is a need for such functional practical differentiation. However, in the plane of consciousness, the presumption of difference gives rise to an unnatural adventure of suffering and seeking in dilemma. The passage of childhood thus becomes the ground for the eventual conception of the mutually exclusive trinity of God apart, separate self, and world in itself, any world, high or low. The drama implied in the added presumptions of independent self and objective world is generated at a later phase of life than childhood. The child barely comprehends the full force of implication inherent in the concepts of ego and world of things. The child's principal concern is relative to the God-parent reality, or that on which all depends, and relative to his or her growing, but as yet not fully conscious sense of separate self-existence, separate self and objective world, are yet hidden in unconsciousness for the child. The concepts of separate self and objective world are a latter and mysterious comprehension of that which is, at first, only felt, not conceptualized as fear and sorrow. Therefore, the child is always grasping for permanent security in a non-differentiated, unborn bliss, wherein the threats implied in life are forgotten and unknown. Reunion through obedience is the manner in which the living child learns in secret, while the life that grows the child through experience continually demonstrates the failure of all childish seeking. There must be a transition from childhood to maturity. That transition is commonly acknowledged as a stage in the psychophysical development of the human being. It is called adolescence. Like childhood, this stage also tends to be prolonged indefinitely, and indeed, perhaps the majority of civilized human beings are occupied with the concerns of this transition most of their lives. The transitional stage of adolescence is marked by a sense of dilemma, just as the primal stage of childhood is marked by a sense of dependence. It is in this transitional stage that the quality of living one's existence as a dilemma is conceived. It is the dilemma imposed by the conventional presumption of separate, egoic, independent consciousness, and thus separative habits and action. That presumption is, altogether, the inevitable inheritance from childhood, and its clear, personal comprehension, felt over against the childish urge to dependence, is what initiates the ambivalent conflicts of the phase of adolescence. The dilemma of adolescence is a continual goad to dramatization. It is the drama of the double bind of dependence versus independence. Adolescence is the origin of cleverness and, in general, of mind. What we conventionally call the conscious mind is a strategic version of mind which is always manufacturing motivations. And in the adolescent, these motivations or desires are mutually exclusive or contradictory. This is because the adolescent is always playing with impulsive allegiance to two mutually exclusive principles: dependence and independence. The early or childhood condition yields the tendency to presume dependence, but the conventional learning of childhood, as well as the inherent growth pattern of the individual psychophysical being, yields to the growing person the equally powerful tendency to presume independence. The result is conventional consciousness or conscious mind, as opposed to the unconsciousness of childhood. But that conventional consciousness is strategic in nature, and its foundation is the conception of life as dilemma. Therefore, adolescence is the origin of the great search in all adult human beings. Adolescence is an eternally failed condition, an irrevocable double bind. It is the very form of Narcissus, the eternal self-absorption or immunity achieved by impulsive psychophysical flight from the impositions of relational life. The solutions developed in the adolescent theater of human life phase between the exotic and exclusive extremes of either yielding to the state of egoic dependence, thus tending to disintegrate character, or asserting the status of egoic independence, thus tending to rigidify character. Both extremes remain tenuous, threatened by the possibility of the opposite destiny, and involve an ongoing sense of dilemma. Humanity makes culture and adventure out of such ambivalence. In the case of the yielding toward the childish condition of dependence, there is more of the mystical, invocatory, absorbed tendency. In the case of the revolutionary assertion of independence, there is more of the analytical, materialistic, discriminative tendency. In the adolescent range between these two extremes are all of the traditional and usual solutions of humankind, including the common understanding of religious and spiritual life. Traditional spirituality, in the forms in which it is most commonly proposed or presumed, is a characteristically adolescent creation that represents an attempted balance between the extremes. It is not a life of mere or simple absorption in the mysterious enclosure of existence. It is a life of strategic absorption. It raises the relatively non-strategic and unconscious life of childhood dependence to the level of a fully strategic conscious life of achieved dependence or absorption. Its goal is not merely psychological reunion, but total psychic release into some imagined or felt home of being. By the time the child fully achieves the life strategy of obedience to that on which all depends, he or she has entered the phase of adolescence. At that point, the individual fully presumes the ego self and the world as apparently independent or objective dimensions, exclusive of or other than the reality that is the goal of all dependence. Therefore, the path of obedience, fully developed, is already a path of dilemma, of conflict, of struggle with self, as every religious person comes to understand through experience. Truly, then, the experiential fruition of the life strategy of childhood or dependence is fully demonstrated only in the advent of human adolescence. In every form of its adventure, the path of experience and attainment conceived in adolescence is a struggle for solutions to a principal dilemma. And that dilemma is itself the characteristic quality of all such adventures, as well as of the ordinary suffering of the usual human being. In adolescence, the separated, and separative self is the motivating presumption behind the common suffering and the common heroism of humanity, both in life and in spirit. The sense of permanently independent existence is the source of the dilemma that undermines the non-differentiated dependence of mere birth. In the adolescent, there is the unrelenting search for the success, self-fulfillment, unthreatened security, immunity, healing, extreme longevity, immortality, and ultimate salvation of the presumed ego I. The ego, self, or soul is the primary presumption of the adolescent, just as God apart, or that on which all depends, is the primary presumption of the child. Therefore, in the usual human being, who is embedded in the adolescent conception of existence, the idea of God falls into doubt or is chronically resisted. Thus, sin, or missing the mark, enters into the mind of adolescence, and the world becomes merely a scene of the adolescent drama in which even the very stuff of the world is viewed as a problem, a principal warfare of opposites, and in which the manipulation of conditionally manifested things, rather than the realization of the eternally present nature, condition, state, form, and process of reality itself, becomes the hope of peace. There is a mature, real, and true phase of human life. Real and true human maturity is free of all childish things and free of all that is attained, acquired, and made in the adolescent adventures of conventional life. In that mature phase, the principle of separation is undermined by means of real self-understanding, and the mutually exclusive trinity of God, self, and world is returned to the condition of truth itself. In the maturity of human life, the world is not abandoned, nor is it lived as the scene of adolescent theater, the adventure in dilemma. God apart occupies the child, and separate self occupies the adolescent, and both child and adolescent see the world only in terms of their own distinct limiting principle or characteristic form of suffering. But in the mature human being, the world, or the totality of all arising, subjective and objective, high and low, not as an exclusive reality, but in truth, is primary. In the mature individual, the world is potentially apprehended as a modification of the single, indivisible, absolute, non-separate reality, implying no separate self and no outside God. For such a one, the absolute reality and the world are not different. The absolute reality is the divine nature, condition, state, form, and process of all and all. The absolute reality includes all that is manifest and all that is unmanifest, all universes, conditions, beings, states, and things, all that is within and all that is without, all that is visible and all that is invisible, all that is here and all that is there, all dimensions of space-time and all that is prior to space-time. Clearly, the search for fulfillment via experiences of all kinds is the principal characteristic of both the childish and the adolescent stages of human development. The experiential dimensions of the divine transforming power contains every possibility for the holy or unholy fascination of children and adolescents. Therefore, my divine avataric transcendental spiritual blessing grace always works to disentangle human beings from their lingering strategic life motives, so that they may enter into the final or mature phase of life. It is only on the basis of such human maturity that life and truth may be realized, and the experiential drama of unconsciousness, egoity, conventional mind, and strategic motivation may be understood. The mature phase of human life is not characterized by either unconscious dependence or the strategically conscious dilemma of dependence-independence. Rather, the mature phase of human life is the phase of relational participation rather than childish dependence, and real human responsibility rather than adolescent independence. As in childhood, there is no problem-based strategy at the root of the mature phase of life. Childhood is a realm of unconsciousness, whereas the mature person is freely conscious. Unlike the adolescent, the mature human being conceives no irreducible dilemma in life and conscious awareness. This mature phase of life requires, as its ongoing foundation, the at least eventual, most fundamental understanding of the egoic self. The separate and separative principle of independent self, the strategies of mind and desires, the usual ego-possessed life of the avoidance of relationship, the urges toward unconscious dependence and mechanical or wild independence, and all the mediocre solutions that temporarily balance or fulfill the extremes of experience. All of these must be obviated in most fundamental self-understanding. The mature or responsible and truly conscious phase of life is, thus, the origin of the real practice of life or true action, and the mature phase of life, fully demonstrated, is characterized not by the usual religious and spiritual solutions, but by no seeking, no dilemma, no orientation toward the goal of any conceived or remembered state or condition. Only in the mature phase of life can you realize the perfectly prior and thus always present self-nature, self-condition, and self-state that is reality itself. Only a human being, thus free, knows conditionally manifested existence in and as the self-nature and self-condition and self-state of the real and intrinsically egoless and perfectly acausal divine, which is also the process and form and light and fullness of all the worlds. Here ends the recitation of the Lefion.